Welcome to the second video of our series of ecosystem diversity. On this one, we're going to be focusing on how changes to biotic and abiotic factors, the physical and biological aspects of an ecosystem, can actually lead to shifts in the populations and the nature of the ecosystem itself. So in other words, disruptances to the ecosystem and how the ecosystems manage and change because of it. So one good place to start is to talk about the idea of a keystone species. Those are crucial organisms that are their presence changes the entire nature of the ecosystem. Like an otter, or ocean otter, they hunt the clams and mussels that live in the ocean. Without them, the entire coastal ecosystem would change. If you look at beavers, like they're even called ecosystem engineers, without a beaver, you wouldn't have the beaver pond. And without a beaver pond, the fish, the bugs, and the things that eat the fish and the bugs, like amphibians and songbirds, it all gets affected by that beaver pond, right? So they're very, very important. But I want to tell a story of perhaps one of the most awesome American stories of keystone species, which is the idea of the gray wolf having left the Yellowstone Park. Cascades of effects took place. Now, by the way, this idea that a change to the food web can cause effects all throughout it is called cascade effects. And it's surprising that it's not just the ones that are directly eaten by it or that eat the organism that gets affected. Everybody feels shockwaves of the change. So when the wolf left, there was less eating of elk, right? So the elk was dying less. So the elk populations went up. But when the elk populations went up, there was less food now for scavengers that ate the carcasses that wolves put down. So things from eagles, ravens, bears, all of them suffered because of that. Meanwhile, the coyotes also started to thrive because they didn't have the competition of the wolves. So they started growing. But that was a problem, though, for foxes, voles, and antelopes, which suffered because of the coyotes and cleese. The beaver almost went extinct on Yellowstone because the elk ate so much of the willow trees and aspen trees that is used for food and shelter on the beavers and their dams that the beavers almost died. But remember, without the beavers, that sends shockwaves to insects, fish, amphibians, and songbirds. Oh my gosh, the entire ecosystem changes. But one thing that's also not in this slide is that even the river changed directions. And I'll talk about that when I talk about the recovery. So now they introduced the wolves back in 1995. And over the last 25 years, it only took 25 years for the ecosystem's diversity to improve. The eagles, bears, and ravens are now full of carcasses that they can eat, with all of the over 60 wolves that live in the Yellowstone Park. I think it's between 60 and 100. I don't remember exactly how many, but there are so many now at the time this video was recorded that there's enough carcasses to go around for the scavengers. Elk numbers have gone back down, which has helped the beavers, and the elk's actually healthier because the weak are being killed off by the wolf. When the wolf left, they had no predators killing them anymore. The bears don't really take them down. So this is good for the elk. It's also good for the population of buffalo. Likewise, the old and weak are being killed off, making the population stronger. They're culling the herds. The beavers growing back, the new beaver ponds all over the place. And then that means the fish improve and the amphibians improve and the songbirds and the insects all starting to thrive. Coyotes went back down, which helped the populations of voles and foxes and antelopes recover from being going down. So see, these changes all throughout the food web. But what about abiotic changes, right? With more trees staying around, now that changes the way the erosion patterns work and how much water runs off the land, which changes the amount of sediments which are being deposited on the rivers, which change the way that the banks and the rivers flow. Of course, the beavers will change the flow of water as well. More beavers means changes to the river. So even the flow of the river changes. Now, if the flow of the river changes, all kinds of things will change the result as well. And so this story of a keystone species in Yellowstone is an amazing example of the value of protecting every single species in a food web, especially those which are apex predators like the gray wolf, because they're definitely keystone. They're definitely a key species in maintaining the stability of ecosystems. By the way, this is just the tip of the iceberg, okay? Way, way, way more effects happen. From bunnies to bugs to decomposers, everybody gets affected. That's why it's called a cascade effect. Now, here's an example of a change that's abiotic, causing cascade effects in the ecosystem. When an algae bloom happens, it happens because lakes which are old lakes, have had way too much stuff live and die in them. And over long periods of time, that causes an increase in nutrients to a point that causes problems. This could also happen suddenly if there's way too much runoff, especially because of agricultural runoff and with fertilizers and stuff like that put by humans. And then when that gets dumped into a river or a lake, it can cause this to happen much faster than it would naturally. Now, all lakes tend to go this way eventually in their lifetime, especially if they're enclosed lakes that don't get fed by natural springs, or that's where the water circulates. Eventually, too many nutrients will gather there and this will happen. The uptake of nutrients causes a massive growth of algae. The algae starts to grow and get mucky and grow over all surfaces, including the plants which are under the water. So the underwater plants will start to die off. We're killing the organisms that depend and live on them for shelter. The excess of plants will also cause an increase on production of photosynthesis until the entire covering of the lake is covered with algae, and that will cause all the species that rely on sunlight living underneath it to die, all the plants. Now, all those algae, even though they do a lot of photosynthesis and produce oxygen, they will end up dying off faster than things will eat them, and then they will just fall to the bottom and fall this muck of dead stuff that ends up decomposing by the decomposers. And a little after that, a massive uptake of carbon dioxide will be produced, which will cause complete suffocation of anything that was still alive. So the whole lake dies, right, because of this. And so this process of succession, called eutrophication, happens at the end of the lake's lives, or if the lake gets a sudden influx of that. And that is because of an abiotic change in the amount of nutrients, causing massive biotic changes throughout the ecosystem, right? So how about when a tree falls in the forest? A tree falls, and now suddenly you have a biotic change, a death, right, of a life form. But then abiotic changes to physical factors happen. Now you have more sunlight going through the canopy, which has an opening out through it, and then now the sunlight hits the floor. That allows new plants like grasses and shrubs to start growing in that space, in that opening. And you can have a miniature meadow growing for a while. The tree itself will start becoming decomposed, and so you have got a rush of decomposers coming to that area, breaking down that tree and adding more nutrients, and that way recycling life of an old tree that wasn't growing much. Instead, now you have lots of life forms of different kinds all growing in that space. So this is part of the natural healthy cycle of a forest. The death of the old and no longer growing to replace with new variety of life. It actually increases biodiversity when that one tree died. Likewise, I don't have a picture of this, but when the whales' carcasses die, the carcass falls eventually to the bottom of the ocean, and then over decades, organisms will live and feed off of that, from mussels and clams and crabs and lobsters and worms, starfish. All kinds of life will actually break down and eat that over many, many decades, creating a whole miniature ecosystem on a place that otherwise would not have much life because there's not a lot of sunlight. So there's not a lot of photosynthesis to support an ecosystem. So it has to live off the dead stuff coming from above, a gift from above. How about something like a loss of by the way, that was another biotic change, right? Death causes that to change. How about the loss of a key nutrient? So an abiotic change, like the loss of water. So then you have drought. That drought is going to cause thousands and thousands of plants to die off. And since they're the producers that support the entire food web, everything collapses, right? So drought's pretty bad for ecosystems. It lowers the biodiversity of the ecosystem. How about deforestation? Whether it's natural because of a wildfire or maybe caused by humans. Well, that's going to cause a loss of life, right, due to that fire. And then, or it could be a biotic change, humans causing it. But whatever caused it, afterwards, you're going to have less soil because the dead trees are no longer going to make leaves to actually enrich the soil. And then if it rains, because there's no trees to hold the soil in place, it might actually pull the soil away, causing landslides, right? Now, that also might enrich the soil somewhere else because those nutrients will be dumped by that position somewhere, maybe in the oceans, causing a bloom of life there, right? But that ecosystem, though, where we were talking about, it's probably going to lose diversity. And because it loses diversity, we're going to talk about that in the next video, it's also going to be less likely to survive future disruptances. So when humans cut down trees, You also not only do you make the ecosystem itself die in that area, and everybody that relied on it, all the animals that lived in that habitat are not going to have their homes anymore, but also that forest that's left is going to have less diversity to survive further disturbances in the future. We'll talk about that in the next video. A last example, let's talk about coral reefs. So a biotic change happens because of abiotic factor, temperature changing. Right now, the global warming has killed over 50% of the coral reefs that used to live in this planet. The Great Barrier Reef near Australia is at a point that it's probably never going to recover anymore. So it's still around, but not like it used to be centuries ago. The reason for it is because the increase in temperatures due to the recent climate change is causing the coral to overheat. And when it does, it pushes away from it inside of it a symbiotic algae that lives inside of it that helps it eat. And that ends up killing it too, but as a last dash to survive, it can't handle the algae when it's overheating. So it expels the algae and it bleaches because the algae is what gives it its color. And it ends up looking like that. Ugly, what it used to be a beautiful coral reef because of this process of coral bleaching due to overheating. And then the coral, of course, dies, and then the entire ecosystem that depends on the coral for its diversity dies with it. So major loss in diversity. So from the understory of forests to the underwater of coral reefs to droughts in ecosystems to keystone species in Yellowstone Park, every time a biotic or abiotic factor, remember biotic is living, abiotic is non-living. So in other words, like the living and the physical aspects of the environment change, it can cause shock waves effects that affect the entire ecosystem. And that's why it's important to be diverse, which is what I'm going to talk about in the next video, because diversity protects you from complete destruction doing something like a disruption like that. So I'll talk about that on the next video. See you guys then.